In the grand corridors of Valdoria Palace, where every whisper echoes through centuries of tradition and every glance carries the weight of kingdoms, sometimes the most powerful moments happen in complete silence. When duty collides with the heart, when protocol wars with genuine emotion, and when the future of a crown hangs in the balance of a single, stolen moment. That's when true character reveals itself. What you're about to witness unfolds behind the gilded doors where cameras never venture, where three souls bound by destiny must navigate the treacherous waters of love, loyalty, and the ultimate sacrifice for the realm. The autumn rain drummed against the towering windows of Valdoria Palace, each droplet catching the amber light from the ancient chandeliers that had witnessed countless royal ceremonies, celebrations, and secret sorrows. King Alexander stood in the blue drawing room, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the sprawling gardens that stretched toward the misty mountains beyond. At 68, his once golden hair had silvered, but his blue eyes still held the intensity that had marked his reign for over 3 decades. The palace hummed with its usual activities, servants preparing for the evening's state dinner, advisors reviewing tomorrow's parliamentary meetings, and security details conducting their silent patrols. Yet beneath this orchestrated normalcy, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. The king's marriage to Queen Isabella had been the subject of whispered conversations for months now, ever since the tabloids had begun their relentless speculation about the growing distance between the royal couple. Princess Elena entered the drawing room with the grace that had been drilled into her since childhood. At 35, she possessed an ethereal beauty that photographers captured, but never quite conveyed. The way she moved, as if floating, how her green eyes seemed to hold depths of understanding that made even hardened diplomats pause mid-sentence. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore a simple navy dress that somehow managed to look both regal and approachable. "Your Majesty," she said softly, offering a slight curtsy that spoke more of affection than obligation. Alexander turned, and for a moment, his stern expression softened completely. This was the look that palace insiders had begun to notice, the way the king's entire demeanor changed when Princess Elena entered a room. It wasn't the polite attention he showed other members of the royal family or distinguished guests. This was something deeper, more personal, more dangerous. "Elena," he said, her name carrying more weight than any royal title. "I was hoping you'd come." She moved closer, and the space between them seemed to shimmer with unspoken words. Elena had married into the royal family 8 years ago when she wed Prince Marcus, Alexander's younger son. The marriage had been arranged, as was tradition, but it had grown into something warm and companionate. Marcus was a good man, kind, dutiful, and genuinely fond of his wife. But he was also often absent, pursuing his military career and various charitable endeavors that kept him traveling throughout the kingdom and beyond. It was during one of Marcus's longer absences, when Elena had stepped in to help with various royal duties, that she and Alexander had discovered their connection. It had begun innocently enough, shared conversations about policy, literature, and the weight of serving their people. Elena possessed a sharp intelligence that complemented Alexander's experience, and she had insights into the younger generation's concerns that proved invaluable to his decision-making. But somewhere between the late-night strategy sessions and the quiet moments stolen in the palace gardens, something had shifted. Neither had spoken of it directly, but both felt the pull, a magnetism that defied protocol, propriety, and the very foundations of everything they'd sworn to uphold. "The Norwegian delegation seemed quite impressed with your presentation today," Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral despite the intensity in his eyes. Elena smiled, an expression that managed to be both radiant and melancholy. "They responded well to the education initiative. I think we can expect their support for the literacy programs." They stood there, discussing policy and diplomatic matters, but their words carried double meanings that would be invisible to any observer, yet crystal clear to each other. This had become their way, conducting entire emotional conversations through the language of state business and royal obligations. Isabella retired early tonight, Alexander mentioned casually, though nothing about the statement felt casual. Queen Isabella, 12 years Alexander's senior, had been his wife for 35 years. Their marriage, too, had been arranged, uniting two powerful houses in an alliance that had brought peace and prosperity to the realm. Isabella was a remarkable woman in her own right, intelligent, dignified, and fiercely protective of the crown's reputation. But the years had taken their toll. She suffered from chronic pain that limited her public appearances, and the emotional distance between her and Alexander had become a chasm that protocol forced them to bridge only in public. Elena nodded, understanding the subtext. The Queen's early retirement meant they had this rare moment alone, away from the careful choreography of palace life, where every interaction was observed, analyzed, and reported. "I've been thinking about the children's hospital visit next week," Elena said, but her eyes said something entirely different. They spoke of the growing impossibility of their situation, of feelings that threatened to overwhelm the careful boundaries they'd constructed. Alexander stepped closer, close enough that he could catch the subtle scent of her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of the palace rose gardens where they'd shared so many conversations. "Elena," he began, then stopped himself. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made them both freeze. Elena immediately moved to the window, creating appropriate distance, while Alexander straightened his already perfect posture. But the footsteps passed without stopping, leaving them alone again with the weight of everything unsaid. "I should go," Elena whispered, but she didn't move. "Yes," Alexander agreed, but he didn't step away either. Instead, he reached out, his fingers barely brushing hers. It was the lightest touch imaginable, yet it sent shockwaves through both of them. For a moment that lasted an eternity, they stood connected by that whisper-like contact, two souls bound by duty, yet pulled towards something that could destroy everything they'd worked to protect. Elena's breath caught, and she looked up into Alexander's eyes. In them, she saw her own internal struggle reflected, the war between desire and duty, between personal happiness and the greater good of the realm. They both knew that what they felt was real and powerful and absolutely impossible. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10 o'clock, breaking the spell. Elena withdrew her hand slowly, the loss of contact almost physical in its intensity. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said formally, but her voice carried the tremor of suppressed emotion. "Good night, Your Royal Highness," he replied, matching her formal tone while his eyes conveyed everything his words could not. Elena left the blue drawing room with measured steps, but once she reached her private apartments, she leaned against the closed door and allowed herself to tremble. What was happening between her and Alexander was dangerous beyond measure. It threatened not just their personal reputations, but the stability of the entire monarchy. Yet she couldn't deny the depth of feeling that grew stronger each day. Meanwhile, Alexander remained in the drawing room long after her departure, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens. He thought about his duty to the crown, his responsibility to his people, and his obligation to Isabella, who had been a faithful partner in ruling the kingdom even if their personal connection had faded years ago. But he also thought about Elena's laugh, her brilliant insights during policy discussions, and the way she made him feel alive in a way he'd forgotten was possible. In another wing of the palace, Queen Isabella sat in her private study, reading diplomatic cables with a thoroughness that had made her one of the most respected royal consorts in Europe. But her mind kept wandering to the changes she'd observed in her husband over recent months. Isabella was not a foolish woman, nor was she blind to the subtleties of human nature. She'd built her life around careful observation and strategic thinking, skills that serve her well as queen, but made it impossible to ignore the signs. She'd noticed how Alexander's demeanor changed when Princess Elena entered a room. She'd seen the way their conversations seemed to carry undercurrents that had nothing to do with policy or protocol. She'd observed the careful distance they maintained in public and understood it for what it was, not indifference, but its opposite. Isabella set down the papers and walked to her window, looking out at the same gardens that Alexander could see from the blue drawing room. At 70, she was still a striking woman, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture regal despite the arthritis that caused her constant discomfort. She'd spent her entire adult life in service to the crown, sacrificing personal desires for the greater good of the realm. Now, faced with the growing connection between her husband and Elena, Isabella found herself at a crossroads. She could confront the situation directly, potentially causing a scandal that would rock the monarchy. She could ignore it, hoping it would fade on its own. Or she could find another path, one that served the crown's interests while acknowledging the human hearts beneath the royal titles. As the rain continued to fall on Valdoria Palace, three people struggled with the weight of unspoken truths and impossible choices. The foundation of their carefully ordered world was shifting beneath their feet, and none of them could predict where the cracks might lead. The palace's ancient walls had witnessed many such dramas over the centuries: forbidden loves, political intrigue, and the eternal tension between personal desire and royal duty. But this particular story was far from over, and the consequences of the choices yet to be made would ripple through the kingdom and beyond. In the silence of their separate apartments, Alexander, Elena, and Isabella each faced the same question. What price were they willing to pay for love, for duty, and for the preservation of everything they'd sworn to protect? Part 2, the morning sun painted the palace walls in shades of gold and amber as the royal household began its carefully orchestrated daily routine. Servants moved through the corridors with practiced silence, preparing for another day of ceremonies, meetings, and the endless dance of diplomatic protocol that kept the kingdom running smoothly. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, the events of the previous evening had set something irreversible in motion. Princess Elena stood on her private balcony, watching the gardeners tend to the autumn flowers below. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of her encounter with King Alexander. The brush of his fingers against hers had been seared into her memory, a touch so brief, yet so profound that it seemed to have changed something fundamental in the fabric of her reality. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Your Royal Highness?" came the voice of Margaret, her lady-in-waiting. "Prince Marcus has called from Northumberland. He's on the secure line." Elena's stomach tightened. Marcus, her husband, the man who loved her genuinely and completely, even if that love lacked the intensity that now threatened to consume her. She walked to her private study and picked up the encrypted phone that connected her to royal family members anywhere in the world. "Darling," Marcus's warm voice filled the room. "How are you? I heard the Norwegian meeting went brilliantly." "Hello, Marcus," Elena said, forcing brightness into her tone. "Yes, the education initiative received strong support. When will you be returning?" There was a pause, and Elena could picture her husband's earnest face, probably windswept from his morning ride across the Northumberland estate where he was overseeing new veterans' housing projects. "That's actually why I'm calling. The construction has hit some complications with the local planning committee. I may need to extend another week, possibly two. I know it's terrible timing with the state dinner for the Swedish Prime Minister coming up." Relief and guilt warred in Elena's chest. "Don't worry about the dinner. I can handle the protocol meetings with His Majesty." "You're a treasure, Elena. Honestly, I don't know how the family managed before you came along. Father speaks of you constantly, says you have the finest political mind of anyone in the younger generation." Elena closed her eyes, Marcus's innocent praise feeling like a knife twist. "He's very kind." "Kind nothing. He's right. Listen, I have to dash to another meeting, but I wanted to hear your voice." "I miss you." "I miss you too," Elena said, and realized with horror that she wasn't sure if it was true anymore. After the call ended, Elena remained seated at her desk, staring at the official portrait of herself and Marcus that graced the mantelpiece. They looked happy in the photograph. She in her wedding gown, he in his military dress uniform, both smiling radiantly on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. It had been a beautiful wedding, watched by millions around the world, and she had felt genuine joy at joining this family that had welcomed her with such warmth. But that was before she'd truly come to know Alexander, before their shared work had revealed the depths of his character, before she discovered that the measured, protocol-bound king possessed a brilliant, passionate soul that called to something deep within her own heart. 3 floors below, in the king's private study, Alexander was having his own morning crisis of conscience. His secretary had just informed him that Princess Elena would indeed be handling the protocol arrangements for the Swedish state dinner, which meant hours of planning sessions, just the two of them reviewing seating charts, menu selections, and diplomatic considerations. He should assign the task to someone else. He should create distance, maintain proper boundaries, and stop this madness before it went any further. But even as he thought it, Alexander knew he wouldn't do it. The prospect of those planning sessions, of Elena's insightful questions, and the way she challenged his thinking was like a lifeline to a drowning man. Sir, his private secretary, James, had been with the royal household for 20 years and possessed the rare ability to read the king's moods with uncanny accuracy. Shall I confirm a schedule with Her Royal Highness? Alexander nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. As James left to make the arrangements, Alexander's thoughts turned to Isabella. His wife had been unusually quiet at breakfast, picking at her food while reviewing the morning briefings with an intensity that seemed forced. She'd always been good at reading between lines. It was one of the qualities that had made her such an effective queen. How long before she recognized what was happening right under her nose? The answer came sooner than he expected. Queen Isabella entered his study without knocking, a liberty she rarely took anymore. She moved slowly, her arthritis particularly troublesome in the damp autumn weather, but her bearing remained regal and her mind sharp as ever. "Alexander," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk with careful dignity. "We need to talk." His blood chilled, but he maintained his composure. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Isabella studied him with those intelligent brown eyes that had first attracted him 36 years ago when they'd met at a diplomatic reception. She'd been beautiful then, brilliant now, and infinitely patient in ways that had probably saved his sanity during the more difficult years of his reign. "I've been watching," she said simply. "I've seen the way you look at her, Alexander. More importantly, I've seen the way she looks at you." The words hung in the air like a confession that could topple kingdoms. Alexander's first instinct was to deny everything, to fall back on royal protocol and wounded dignity. But Isabella deserved better than lies, and honestly, he was exhausted from pretending. "Isabella, let me finish," she said gently but firmly. "I'm not angry, Alexander. Hurt, yes. Concerned about the implications, absolutely. But not angry." She paused, gathering her thoughts with the same deliberation she brought to all her royal duties. "We both know what our marriage has been. It was arranged for the good of the realm, and it served that purpose admirably. We've been partners, allies, and yes, friends. But we've never been lovers in the truest sense, have we?" Alexander felt as if the ground were shifting beneath his feet. In 35 years of marriage, they'd never had this conversation, never acknowledged the emotional distance that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "You've been a remarkable queen," he said quietly. "The kingdom owes you more than they'll ever know." "That's not what I asked," Isabella replied with a small smile. "I asked if we've ever been truly in love." The question demanded honesty, even if that honesty could shatter whatever peace they'd maintained all these years. "No," Alexander admitted. "We haven't." Isabella nodded, as if he'd confirmed something she'd long suspected. "And now you are. In love, I mean. With Elena." It wasn't a question, and Alexander found himself unable to form a denial. The weight of keeping the secret had been crushing him, and having it acknowledged, even in these circumstances, brought an unexpected relief. "Nothing has happened," he said firmly. "Nothing inappropriate. We've maintained all proper boundaries." "I know," Isabella said. "You're both too honorable for anything else. But feelings don't respect boundaries, do they?" She rose from her chair with effort, walking to the window that looked out over the rose gardens where Alexander and Elena had shared so many conversations. The question now is what we do about it. Isabella, I would never what? Never fall in love? Too late for that. Never act on those feelings? Perhaps. But, Alexander, you're not a statue or a symbol. You're a man, and you spent your entire life serving everyone except yourself. The queen turned back to face her husband, and Alexander was struck by the sadness in her eyes, but also by a kind of peace he hadn't expected. I won't lie to you, she continued. This situation terrifies me. Not because I'm jealous. We're beyond that, aren't we? But because of what it could mean for the crown, for Elena, for Marcus, for all of us. But I also can't bear the thought of you living the rest of your life without knowing what it means to love and be loved completely. Alexander stared at his wife, this remarkable woman who continued to surprise him even after decades of marriage. What are you saying? I'm saying that we need to find a way through this that serves everyone's best interests. The kingdoms, the families, and, yes, perhaps even yours and Elena's. Before Alexander could respond, Isabella moved toward the door. But we must be very careful. The slightest misstep could bring down everything we've built. She paused with her hand on the door handle. Alexander, whatever happens, we handle this together, as we've handled everything else. After she left, Alexander sat in stunned silence. He'd expected confrontation, recriminations, perhaps even threats. Instead, Isabella had offered something far more complex and potentially dangerous, understanding. Meanwhile, Elena was experiencing her own unexpected encounter. She'd been reviewing the guest list for the Swedish state dinner when a soft knock announced another visitor. To her surprise, Queen Isabella entered the small office where Elena handled her official correspondence. Your Majesty, Elena said, rising quickly and offering a curtsy. Please sit, Isabella said. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to discuss the dinner arrangements personally. They spent several minutes reviewing the planned seating arrangements and menu selections, but Elena could sense an undercurrent to the conversation that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol. Queen Isabella's questions seemed designed to test Elena's understanding of palace dynamics, her discretion, and, perhaps most importantly, her loyalty to the royal family. You've adapted remarkably well to royal life, Isabella observed as they concluded their review. It's not easy joining this family. The scrutiny, the expectations, the way every action is analyzed and interpreted. I've been fortunate to have such guidance, Elena replied carefully. Yes, Isabella said thoughtfully. We all need guidance sometimes, particularly when we find ourselves in complicated situations. The words were spoken casually, but Elena felt their weight. She looked into the Queen's intelligent eyes and saw knowledge there, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Your Majesty? Isabella gathered her papers with deliberate care. Elena, dear, you're a bright young woman with excellent judgment. I trust you'll continue to make choices that serve the greater good. After the Queen left, Elena sat in her chair, heart pounding. The conversation had been perfectly polite, entirely appropriate, and absolutely loaded with meaning. Queen Isabella knew. The question was, what would she do about it? As afternoon faded into evening, 3 members of the royal family found themselves changed by the day's revelations. Lines had been crossed, truths acknowledged, and the careful balance they'd all maintained was shifting into something entirely new and potentially dangerous. The palace continued its ancient rhythms around them, but for Alexander, Elena, and Isabella, there was no going back to the comfortable fiction of the past. They were entering uncharted territory where duty and desire would clash in ways that could reshape the very foundations of the crown they'd all sworn to serve. Part 3, the Swedish state dinner arrived with all the pageantry that Valdoria's centuries-old protocol demanded. The grand ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers as diplomats, nobles, and distinguished guests gathered for an evening that would be analyzed and discussed in foreign ministries across Europe. Yet for those who knew where to look, The real drama was unfolding not on the main stage, but in the subtle interactions between three members of the royal family. Princess Elena moved through the pre-dinner reception with practiced grace, discussing trade agreements with the Swedish delegation and charming the assembled ambassadors with her fluent command of their languages. She wore a stunning gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her eyes, and the Valdoria emerald necklace, a piece traditionally worn by the king's closest female relatives, drew admiring glances throughout the room. The choice of jewelry had been Queen Isabella's suggestion, delivered that morning with characteristic subtlety. "The emeralds will photograph beautifully with your gown," Isabella had said, but Elena understood the deeper message. In the complex language of royal symbolism, the Queen was publicly acknowledging Elena's elevated status within the family hierarchy. King Alexander watched Elena from across the room, maintaining the careful distance that protocol required while feeling the magnetic pull that had only grown stronger since their last private conversation. He was engaged in a discussion with the Swedish Prime Minister about Arctic shipping routes, but part of his attention remained fixed on Elena's every movement, every smile, every gesture that made her seem to float rather than walk through the assembled crowd. "Your daughter-in-law is quite remarkable," the Prime Minister observed, following Alexander's gaze. "Sweden would be fortunate to have such a skilled diplomat representing any nation." "Princess Elena is indeed a treasure," Alexander replied, the simple words carrying layers of meaning that only he could fully comprehend. As dinner was announced, the guests moved into the state dining room with its soaring ceilings and portraits of Valdoria's monarchs stretching back 400 years. The seating arrangement, carefully crafted by Elena and approved by Alexander, placed her at his right hand while the Swedish Prime Minister occupied the seat of honor to his left. Queen Isabella sat across the vast mahogany table, her position allowing her to observe the subtle dynamics playing out under the noses of 150 distinguished guests. The conversation flowed in multiple languages as courses were served on china that had graced royal tables since the 18th century. Elena found herself translating between the king and several Swedish officials who preferred their native language, creating an intimacy of shared communication that would have been impossible in any other setting. Princess Elena's insights into renewable energy policy are remarkable, the Prime Minister's wife commented to Alexander. Has she considered a role in international environmental negotiations? Her talents are certainly being recognized at the highest levels, Alexander replied, allowing himself to glance at Elena with what observers might interpret as professional pride, but which carried far deeper emotions. Throughout the dinner, Queen Isabella maintained her role as the perfect hostess, ensuring conversation never lagged and that every guest felt honored by the royal attention. But those closest to the family might have noticed the way she occasionally studied her husband and daughter-in-law, her expression thoughtful rather than concerned. The real test came during the traditional toasts that concluded the formal dinner. As King Alexander rose to honor their Swedish guests, Elena found herself holding her breath. These ceremonial moments required careful choreography, and any deviation from protocol would be immediately noticed by the diplomatic corps. "To our Swedish friends," Alexander began, his voice carrying easily throughout the grand room, "whose partnership has strengthened both our nations and whose commitment to innovation continues to inspire the world." As glasses were raised and the toast completed, the king's eyes met Elena's across the table for just a moment, a glance that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but felt like an eternity to both of them. In that brief connection, years of careful boundaries seemed to dissolve, leaving only the raw truth of what they meant to each other. Queen Isabella noticed the exchange, as did several sharp-eyed members of the diplomatic corps. But rather than shock or disapproval, the Queen's expression showed something approaching resolution, as if a decision long contemplated was finally crystallizing. Following dinner, the guests moved to the music room for the traditional entertainment, a performance by the Royal Symphony featuring pieces by both Valdorian and Swedish composers. During the intermission, as guests mingled over champagne and coffee, The evening's most significant conversation took place in an alcove overlooking the moonlit gardens. Elena had stepped outside for a breath of fresh air when Alexander appeared beside her, both of them maintaining careful distance from the other guests, but close enough for private conversation. "The evening has gone beautifully," Alexander said, his formal words belied by the intensity in his voice. "The Swedish delegation seems very pleased," Elena replied, equally formal and equally weighted with subtext. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the play of moonlight on the fountain that had graced the palace gardens for 3 centuries. The sounds of conversation and music drifted from the room behind them, creating a cocoon of temporary privacy in the midst of the very public evening. "Elena," Alexander began, then stopped himself, acutely aware that they were surrounded by diplomats, journalists, and guests whose job it was to observe and report every nuance of royal behavior. "I know," Elena said softly, understanding without explanation what he couldn't say. The growing impossibility of their situation, the weight of duty pressing against the demands of the heart, the increasing difficulty of maintaining facades that fooled no one, least of all themselves. "Your Majesty?" "Princess Elena." Queen Isabella's voice interrupted their moment with perfect timing and diplomatic grace. The Prime Minister was hoping to discuss the cultural exchange program before the evening concludes. They turned to find Isabella approaching with the Swedish Prime Minister and his wife, effectively ending any possibility of private conversation while providing a seamless explanation for why the king and Princess Elena had been speaking alone. The remainder of the evening proceeded flawlessly, with diplomatic objectives achieved and international friendships strengthened. But as the last guest departed and the palace returned to its nighttime quiet, the 3 principal players in this evolving drama found themselves forever changed by the evening's events. In his private study, Alexander reviewed the diplomatic cables that had arrived during the dinner, but his mind kept returning to that moment on the terrace when he'd come so close to speaking truths that could never be retracted. The evening had been a success by every measurable standard, yet had also made clear that the status quo was becoming impossible to maintain. Elena sat in her apartment, still wearing the emerald necklace, but having changed into a simple robe, brushing her hair with mechanical strokes while her mind raced. The way Alexander had looked at her during the toast, the careful dance they performed all evening, maintaining proper distance while feeling drawn together by forces that seemed to grow stronger each day. It was exhausting and exhilarating and completely unsustainable. But it was Queen Isabella who made the evening's most significant decision. In her private sitting room, she composed a letter in her distinctive handwriting, not to be typed by secretaries or seen by advisors, but a personal communication that would change the trajectory of all their lives. The letter was addressed to her cousin, the Duchess of Thornbury, whose estate in the countryside had served as a private retreat for the royal family during times of personal crisis. Isabella's message was simple. She needed to borrow the estate for a long weekend, not for rest or recuperation, but for conversations that could not take place within the palace walls. As she sealed the envelope, Isabella reflected on the decision she was about to propose, one that flew in the face of centuries of royal tradition, but which might offer the only path through the crisis that was threatening to tear their family apart. The queen understood better than anyone the price of duty, having sacrificed her own desires on the altar of royal obligation for 35 years. But she also understood that some forces were too powerful to be contained by protocol and tradition. The question now was whether love could find a way to coexist with duty, or whether the monarchy she'd served so faithfully would become another casualty in the eternal war between the heart and the crown. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the palace windows, and the first frost of the season silvered the gardens where so many royal romances had bloomed and withered over the centuries. But this story was different, more complex, carrying implications that would ripple far beyond the palace walls. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the strength of 3 remarkable people, but the very foundations of the institution they devoted their lives to serving. And, in the morning, Queen Isabella would set in motion events that would force them all to choose between the safety of tradition and the dangerous promise of an uncertain future. Part for the Duchess of Thornbury's estate lay nestled in a valley 40 miles from the capital. Its Georgian manor house, surrounded by ancient oaks that blazed with autumn fire. It had served as a refuge for the royal family for over a century, a place where they could shed the weight of ceremony and speak as human beings rather than symbols of state. Now, on a crisp October weekend, it would host the most important conversation in the modern history of the Valdorian monarchy. Queen Isabella had arranged the retreat with characteristic discretion, informing only the most essential security personnel and requesting minimal staff presence. The official reason given was a private family weekend to discuss Princess Elena's upcoming charitable initiatives. The reality was far more complex and potentially explosive. Princess Elena arrived first, driving herself in a simple sedan rather than accepting the official car and driver that protocol would normally require. She'd spent the journey rehearsing possible conversations, trying to prepare for discussions that could reshape her entire future. The weight of the emerald necklace she'd worn to the state dinner seemed to have transferred itself to her shoulders, a reminder of the expectations and obligations that had brought her to this moment. The manor house welcomed her with warm fires and the subtle luxury that marked all royal retreats, comfortable rather than grand, private rather than imposing. Margaret, her lady-in-waiting, had been dismissed for the weekend, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts for the first time in weeks. King Alexander arrived as the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. He'd made the drive himself as well, needing the time to think, to prepare for conversations that might well determine the future of his reign and his family. The casual clothes he wore, trousers, a simple sweater, a jacket appropriate for country walking, made him look younger, more approachable, less like a monarch, and more like the man Elena had fallen in love with. Their greeting was formal, but charged with awareness of their isolation, the absence of watchful eyes and listening ears that normally surrounded every royal interaction. For the first time in months, they were simply Alexander and Elena, not king and princess, and the change in dynamic was both liberating and terrifying. Isabella should be arriving shortly, Alexander said, as they stood in the manor's entrance hall, both acutely conscious that they were truly alone for the first time since their relationship had begun to change. Yes, Elena replied, then found herself with nothing else to say. The carefully constructed conversation topics that had sustained them through countless public interactions seemed inadequate for this moment, this place, this unprecedented situation. They moved to the drawing room where a fire crackled cheerfully in the ancient hearth, but the comfortable furniture and intimate setting only emphasized the tension between them. This was exactly the kind of setting where couples throughout history had declared their love, planned their futures, made commitments that would bind their lives together. But Alexander and Elena existed in a world where such simple human desires were complicated by crowns and obligations and the expectations of entire nations. Queen Isabella's arrival shifted the dynamic once again. She entered the manor house with the same dignity she brought to state occasions, but her bearing was somehow softer, more personal. She'd chosen to drive herself as well, and her simple traveling clothes made her seem less formidable, more approachable than the queenly figure who commanded every royal gathering. "Thank you both for coming," she said as they gathered in the drawing room, settling into chairs arranged around the fireplace like old friends rather than members of a royal household navigating a potential crisis. "Isabella," Alexander began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to establish some ground rules. This weekend, we speak as human beings, not as representatives of the crown. We acknowledge feelings honestly, discuss options openly, and make decisions based on what serves everyone's best interests, including our own happiness." Elena felt her heart racing. Queen Isabella's words seemed to suggest possibilities that protocol and tradition had made unthinkable, but which the heart demanded be explored. I've been doing a great deal of research, Isabella continued, producing a leather portfolio from her handbag. Royal history, constitutional law, precedent from other European monarchies. And I've been thinking about what it means to serve the crown versus what it means to serve ourselves. She opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents that had clearly been prepared with great care and considerable secrecy. There are options, she said simply. They're not conventional, they're not without risk, but they exist. Alexander leaned forward, his political instincts engaging even as his personal emotions swirled. What kind of options? Isabella's answer would have shocked royal watchers around the world, but it was delivered with the same calm certainty she brought to all her royal duties. Divorce, she said. Abdication. Constitutional amendment. Or, she paused, her eyes meeting both Alexander's and Elena's in turn, arrangements that acknowledged the reality of human nature while preserving the stability of the crown. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything they believed about royal life and obligation. Elena felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, with the safe shore of duty behind her, and an uncertain future stretching ahead. Isabella, you can't be serious, Alexander said, but his voice carried hope rather than shock. I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Isabella replied. Alexander, we've spent 35 years in a marriage of convenience and mutual respect. It served the crown well, but it hasn't served either of us as human beings. Elena, you've brought joy and vitality not just to this family, but to my husband specifically in ways I never could. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the grounds where generations of royalty had walked and talked and struggled with the same eternal conflicts between duty and desire. I've spent months watching you both try to deny what's as obvious as sunrise, Isabella continued. You're in love. Deeply, genuinely, completely in love. And that love is making you both miserable because you believe it's incompatible with your duties to the crown. Elena found her voice at last. Isn't it, Your Majesty, we're talking about the stability of the monarchy, the reputation of the royal family, the happiness of 3 people who have devoted their entire lives to service. Isabella interrupted gently. Elena, dear, do you think the monarchy is so fragile that it cannot survive the human emotions of its representatives? Alexander stood and joined his wife at the window. From behind, they looked like what they had always been, partners in the great work of ruling, allies in the challenges of royal life, friends who had weathered decades of storms together. What exactly are you proposing? He asked quietly. Isabella turned to face both of them, her expression calm but determined. I'm proposing that we find a way for all of us to be happy while maintaining the dignity and stability of the crown. Alexander, I'm proposing that we end our marriage formally while remaining partners in ruling. Elena, I'm proposing that you consider what your life might look like if you were free to follow your heart. The implications crashed over Elena like a wave. My marriage to Marcus would need to be addressed as well, Isabella acknowledged. But Marcus deserves honesty, don't you think? Doesn't he deserve the chance to find someone who loves him as completely as you love his father? It was the first time anyone had spoken the truth aloud, and the effect was profound. Elena felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief at finally hearing acknowledged what she'd been trying to deny for so long. Alexander moved closer to Elena, no longer maintaining the careful distance that had characterized all their interactions. Is it what you want? He asked simply. Not what duty demands, not what protocol requires, but what your heart wants. Elena looked up into his eyes and saw her own longing reflected there, but also saw the weight of kingship, the burden of responsibility that would never fully leave his shoulders regardless of what personal happiness they might find together. I want you, she said simply, the words carrying the force of months of suppressed emotion. I love you, Alexander. I love your mind, your dedication to our people, your kindness, your strength. I love you in ways I never thought possible. Alexander's response was to take her hands in his, the same gesture that had electrified them both in the palace drawing room, but now free of the fear and guilt that had accompanied it then. "And I love you," he said, "more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." Queen Isabella watched this exchange with something approaching maternal satisfaction, as if she'd successfully navigated a complex diplomatic negotiation that had required all her skill and experience to bring to a successful conclusion. "Then, we proceed," she said briskly, returning to the portfolio of documents that would form the framework for the most unusual constitutional crisis in Valdorian history. But carefully, deliberately, and with full consideration for everyone involved, including Marcus, including the people of Valdoria, including the future of the monarchy itself. Over the course of that weekend, in the privacy of the Thornbury estate, 3 remarkable people would design a future that honored both the demands of duty and the rights of the human heart. It would require delicate negotiations with Marcus, who would prove more understanding than anyone had dared hope. It would demand careful management of public opinion and the international press. It would necessitate constitutional changes and legal innovations that would set precedents for monarchies around the world. But it would also create a new model for royal life, one that acknowledged that those who wear crowns are also human beings deserving of love, happiness, and the chance to follow their hearts without abandoning their duties to their people. As the weekend drew to a close, Alexander and Elena walked together through the estate gardens, no longer fighting the attraction that had tormented them both for so long. They talked about the future, their future, in terms that just days before would have been impossible to imagine. "It won't be easy," Alexander warned, his arm around Elena's waist as they paused beside the fountain that marked the center of the formal gardens. "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Elena replied, leaning into his warmth and strength. Behind them, Queen Isabella watched from the manor house windows, satisfied with a weekend's work that had transformed 3 lives and quite possibly changed the nature of monarchy itself. She'd spent 35 years in service to the crown, and this might well be her greatest contribution to its future, proving that duty and love need not be enemies, that service to others and service to one's own heart could coexist. The story that had begun with whispered conversations and stolen glances in the corridors of Valdoria Palace had evolved into something unprecedented in royal history. But it was also something timeless, a reminder that beneath the crowns and ceremonies, the protocols and pageantry beat human hearts capable of extraordinary love and willing to risk everything for the chance to honor both duty and desire. As they prepared to return to the palace and begin the delicate work of transforming their private decisions into public reality, all 3 knew they were embarking on a journey that would test every skill they developed in decades of royal service. But for the first time in their lives, they were doing so not as prisoners of obligation, but as architects of their own destiny, building a future where love and duty could finally coexist in harmony.